It is 4 o'clock in the morning on March 18th, 1871.
And it is absolutely freezing.
Right, a really thick, biting fog is just hanging over these steep, you know, these winding cobblestone streets of Montmartre.
You really have to picture the geography here. It's this massive hill overlooking Paris.
Exactly. And General Suspiel, who commands a division of the regular French army, has just successfully marched thousands of his men up this massive hill in the dead of night.
Which is no small feat in that kind of cold.
No, not at all. And their objective is sitting right in front of them in the freezing mist. It's hundreds of heavy artillery cannons.
Cannons that are currently under the control of the Parisian National Guard.
Right. So Suspiel's troops, they secure the perimeter, they seize the guns. It honestly looks like a perfectly executed, flawlessly planned military operation to just disarm a restive capital.
Until you look a little closer.
Yeah. There was just one agonizing, frankly, almost comical problem.
Just a tiny logistical oversight.
Right. In the frantic rush to organize this midnight raid, the high command just straight up forgot to bring the horses.
It is a logistical oversight that, honestly, it literally changes the course of global history.
I mean, you have hundreds of massive iron and bronze cannons and absolutely no physical way to drag them down the hill.
So the regular army just has to sit there.
Yeah, in the freezing cold. They're waiting for hours for these horses to eventually arrive. And as the sun finally comes up, well, Paris wakes up.
And this is where it all goes wrong for the government.
Exactly. The women of Montmartre, including, the radical school teacher and revolutionary Louise Michel, they step out of their front doors carrying milk jugs, just getting ready for the day, and they see the regular army completely surrounding their neighborhood's cannons.
And they do not run away.
Not at all. They start ringing the tocsin, the emergency alarm bells of the local churches.
Which is the universal signal in Paris for an uprising.
Right. And the local National Guard units who actually live in these working-class neighborhoods, they swarm out of their apartments, rifles in hand.
But it's not just armed men. The crowds of women physically place themselves directly between the regular troops and the cannons.
And because the regular soldiers are, they are exhausted. They're freezing. They are deeply, deeply demoralized from this catastrophic war they just lost with Prussia.
They're utterly unwilling to fire on working-class women from their own city.
Exactly. So the military structure simply evaporates on the spot.
Yeah.
General Claude Leconte orders his men to fire on the crowd. He orders them 3 separate times.
And they refuse.
They outright refuse. The troops mutiny. They start fraternizing with the National Guard. And within hours, Leconte and another general, Clement Thomas, are dragged into a nearby garden by the furious crowd and shut against a wall.
It's an explosion of spontaneous violence.
Yeah, and Adolphe Thiers, the head of the conservative national government, he just panics. He orders an immediate total evacuation of the entire state apparatus.
Every single minister, every bureaucrat, every loyal soldier just flees Paris for the nearby Palace of Versailles.
And by the time the sun sets on March 18th, the impossible has happened. The greatest capital city in continental Europe has just been handed, almost entirely by accident, to the armed working class.
And that exact moment, that sudden, completely unexpected triumph, is where the real crisis begins.
It really is. Welcome back to part 2 of our 7-part deep dive into the Paris Commune.
We are continuing our overarching mission here.
Right, which is meticulously unpacking this towering stack of primary texts, letters, memoirs, and historical analyses to truly understand the mechanics of one of history's most dramatic and, honestly, most misunderstood uprisings.
And we need to explicitly connect this right back to our first deep dive, where we walk the physical streets of Georges Eugene Haussmann's Paris.
Yes, definitely keep that in mind. We spent a lot of time in that deep dive establishing the spatial and economic realities of those newly renovated, massive macadamized boulevards.
We looked at how those wide avenues were designed specifically for 2 very distinct purposes.
First, moving military troops rapidly to crush street barricades.
Right. And second, systematically displacing the Parisian working class out of the city center and pushing them into the grim industrial periphery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We laid out the physical architecture of the Second Empire, but today, we are going inside the minds of the people who just seized that architecture.
We are going to map the ideological blueprints that were built right on top of that physical reality.
Because when the government fled to Versailles and the people took over those grand boulevards, the left in Paris was, it was anything but a unified force.
No, it was deeply, fundamentally, and I would say fatally fractured.
Right. The different factions fighting for ideological control of Paris, Specifically, the mutualists, the Blanquists, and the internationalists, they had entirely contradictory visions for what a new society should actually look like.
And dissecting those fractured visions is our main mission for today.
We want to see how these theories functioned, not just in abstract texts, but when they violently collided with the messy, terrifying reality of a besieged city.
But before we dive into the archives, there is a very crucial framing note regarding our sources today.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Today's deep dive relies on some very heavily charged political texts.
We will be reading from Karl Marx. We'll look at later analyses by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, as well as contemporaneous conservative commentators and liberal historians.
Right, and because we are dealing with texts that have, literally shaped modern geopolitical conflicts and the 20th century, we want to be incredibly clear about our role here for you, the listener.
We are strictly impartial reporters of the historical archive.
Exactly. We're not here to endorse the revolutionary theories of the socialists, nor are we here to endorse the conservative defense of the bourgeois state.
Our only job is to rigorously dissect these historical and theoretical arguments exactly as they appear in the texts.
We just want to understand the mechanical logic of what these factions believed, how they justified their actions, and, well, why they violently disagreed with each other.
So with the ringing alarm bells of Montmartre echoing in the background, let's step back from the military crisis for a second.
Yeah, let's look at the daily economic reality of the Parisian worker that actually led to this boiling point.
Because that physical displacement of the artisan under housemen, it created this urgent, desperate search for economic survival.
And to understand the first major ideological faction of the Commune, we really have to introduce Pierre-Joseph Proudhon.
Proudhon offered the most prominent early blueprint for surviving housemen's hyper-capitalist machine.
Let's really set the scene for why Proudhon's ideas were so incredibly appealing to the average person. I want you to look at this from a very granular social level.
Paint a picture of the average worker.
Right. Picture a traditional Parisian artisan in the late 1840s and 1850s, a master shoemaker or a bronze worker or a cabinet maker.
People with highly specialized skills.
Exactly. For generations, they controlled their own tools, their own small shops, their own pace of work. But now, under the Second Empire, vast amounts of centralized financial capital are just flooding the city.
Huge, mechanized factories are opening up. Massive department stores are undercutting their prices.
And the artisan is just being crushed by economies of scale.
Yeah.
They simply can't compete.
And to survive, right, to just buy basic raw materials like leather or wood, that artisan desperately needs credit. They need a loan.
But the big centralized banks of the empire, they either outright refuse to lend to a small shoemaker, or they charge utterly exorbitant predatory interest rates.
The artisan is essentially being bled dry by the financial system.
They're being forced into bankruptcy and pushed down into the ranks of the wage-earning factory proletariat.
Which is a fate they absolutely desperately wanted to avoid. Losing their independence was the ultimate fear.
Right, and this fear of proletarianization is the absolute engine of Proudhon's entire philosophy.
Proudhon developed a comprehensive economic and social theory known as mutualism.
And the absolute cornerstone of mutualist theory is a concept he called credit, gratuit, free credit.
It is an incredibly fascinating workaround, theoretically.
Yeah, imagine proposing a highly localized cooperative credit union. One designed specifically to bypass Wall Street entirely.
A system allowing small producers to trade with each other without ever touching the predatory banking system.
To see how this was supposed to work mechanically, we look at the Banque du Peuple, the People's Bank, which Proudhon officially founded on January 31st, 1849.
Proudhon's ultimate goal here was to completely eliminate loan interest.
Completely zeroed it out.
Right, and eventually to organize all economic exchange without traditional money at all. The objective was to allow producers to receive the absolute full equivalent of their labor.
But, and this is a massive but, that really distinguishes him from later communists, he wanted to do all this while strictly preserving private property and the free market.
Exactly. Proudhon is very famous for the slogan, "Property is theft," which sounds incredibly radical.
Right, it sounds like he wants to abolish all property.
But what he actually opposed was property that derived income without labor.
Like what?
Like landlords extracting rent or bankers extracting interest. He heavily defended the private property of the artisan who owned their own tools and kept the actual fruits of their own labor.
So his theory was that the free market wasn't the actual problem.
No, the monopoly on money was the problem.
So how did the People's Bank actually function? I mean, how do you have a bank with no money and no interest?
The mechanics were based entirely on labor time.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Proudhon believed that lending money at interest was a fundamental moral and economic evil. In his theoretical writings, he argues that lending is not a direct sale.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, if a shoemaker sells you a pair of boots, the transaction is closed. An exchange of equal value has occurred.
Sure, I have boots, you have my cash, we're done.
Right. But if a banker lends you money, Proudhon argued, the banker is essentially selling you the exact same object over and over again.
Oh, through the interest payments.
Precisely. The banker continually receives the price of the loan in the form of interest, month after month, without ever actually giving up their original ownership of the capital.
It's the ultimate rent-seeking behavior. You're just getting paid for doing nothing but holding capital.
Exactly. So to circumvent this entirely, the People's Bank was designed to issue its own paper notes.
Like a parallel currency.
Yes. But these notes were not backed by gold or silver because gold and silver were controlled by the state and the wealthy.
So what were they backed by?
They were secured by the actual products of labor.
Give me an example of how a worker would use this.
If you were a member of the bank, a carpenter, let's say, you could bring your finished chairs to a syndicate. The syndicate would assess how many hours of labor went into those chairs and issue you banknotes equivalent to that exact labor time.
And then I take those labor time notes.
And you could use those notes to buy leather from a shoemaker in the network, who could then use them to buy bread from a baker.
It's an entirely parallel economy. It's almost like a 19th century analog blockchain.
That's actually a really good way to think about it. It was a peaceful revolution.
Right. You don't need to build barricades or shoot generals. You just need a better, fair accounting system. You just ignore the financial monopolies until they wither away.
And it was wildly popular initially.
Oh, hugely popular. Within just a few weeks, the People's Bank had attracted tens of thousands of subscribers from the Parisian working class. The artisans were just desperate for this exact kind of relief.
But of course, we have to look at the historical reality of the archive. This grand experiment, this peaceful mutualist bypass, was a spectacular failure.
A total collapse.
Yeah.
The People's Bank opened at the end of January 1849, and it went completely bankrupt and was forcefully liquidated by early April 1849.
It survived barely 2 months.
So why? How did something with so much popular grassroots support collapse so incredibly fast?
Well, the mechanics of its failure were twofold, practical and structural.
Let's start with the practical.
Practically, Proudhon never managed to secure the initial cash capitalization he needed just to pay the basic administrative overhead and the rent for the bank's physical offices.
Because he was relying on the meager savings of already impoverished workers to capitalize a massive national banking alternative.
Exactly. The math just wasn't there. But more fatally, the political situation turned on him overnight.
Right. Proudhon was a very vocal journalist alongside his economic projects.
And he published a scathing article basically insulting Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the president of the Republic.
Which is never a great business strategy when you're trying to launch a bank.
No, it is not. The state immediately arrested Proudhon. They sentenced him to 3 years in prison for sedition, and the resulting panic just caused a massive run on the bank, forcing its immediate liquidation.
So from a sympathetic perspective, you could easily say Proudhon was just unlucky. He was crushed by the authoritarian state before his beautiful, peaceful system had time to take root.
You could say that, yes.
But that sympathetic view is absolutely not shared by everyone in our archive.
No, it is not.
And this brings us to the most devastating systematic destruction of Proudhon's theories ever put to paper. We are turning to Karl Marx.
The intellectual collision between Proudhon and Marx is, I would argue, one of the most consequential feuds in the history of left-wing thought.
Absolutely. When the People's Bank collapsed, Marx didn't see it as bad luck or poor timing.
Not at all. He saw it as the mathematically inevitable result of a fundamentally flawed, unscientific worldview.
Marx unleashed this critique primarily in his 1847 book, The Poverty of Philosophy.
Which is an incredibly petty and very deliberate inversion of Proudhon's own major work, which was titled The Philosophy of Poverty.
I love that detail. The 19th century socialists did not pull punches when it came to their book titles. It's essentially a massive academic diss track.
It really is. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx absolutely excoriates mutualism. He asserts that Proudhon is not a philosopher of the working class at all.
Right.
Rather, he calls him the ultimate ideologist of the petty bourgeoisie.
We need to define that term clearly, because it gets thrown around a lot in these texts. When Marx says petty bourgeoisie in this specific context, he is talking precisely about that artisan we mentioned earlier.
The small shopkeeper, the master craftsman.
Exactly. They're a transitional class caught right in the middle. They own a tiny bit of property, their hand tools, their little storefront, which makes them distinct from the propertyless factory worker.
But they are constantly deeply terrified of being crushed by the massive industrial bourgeoisie, the big factory owners.
Marx argues that the petty bourgeoisie has a contradictory, almost schizophrenic view of the world.
They hate the big capitalists who are driving them out of business, but they are absolutely terrified of losing their small property and becoming mere wage laborers themselves.
So according to Marx, Proudhon's entire philosophical project is just an attempt to eliminate the bad sides of capitalism.
The monopolies, the crushing interest rates, the extreme poverty.
Right, while desperately trying to maintain the very foundations that create those bad sides in the first place, namely wage labor, market competition, and private property.
So Marx is essentially saying you can't have your cake and eat it too.
You cannot have a capitalist market system of private property without the exploitation that naturally, mathematically results from it.
That is the absolute core of his critique. If we apply the theoretical lens of historical materialism, which is Marx's method of analyzing history, we see exactly where Proudhon goes wrong.
Let's unpack historical materialism a bit for the listener in this context.
Sure. Proudhon viewed economic categories like competition or the division of labor or property as eternal, unalterable concepts.
Like they were just laws of nature.
Yes, he thought these were absolute moral ideas that had just been applied incorrectly by greedy bankers. He believed you could artificially construct a just social order simply by tweaking the dials, like lowering interest rates to zero.
Whereas Marx says that is pure metaphysical nonsense. These economic laws are not eternal truths handed down from heaven. They are transient.
They only exist because of the specific physical way society currently produces things.
Marx captures this brilliantly in one of his most famous theoretical formulations in the book. He writes, "The hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the scheme mill, society with the industrial capitalist."
It's a powerful quote. His point is that you cannot separate the social relations of a society from its physical productive forces.
Right. The steam mill actually requires massive capital. It requires wage labor. It requires exploitation to function profitably.
You cannot keep the steam mill, keep the private ownership of it, but magically legislate away the exploitation. It doesn't work.
So when Proudhon tries to establish free credit, without actually seizing the means of production, without taking over the factories, the land, the real physical wealth of society, Marx warns that it is a complete illusion.
You are just reproducing the exact same frauds of bourgeois capitalism, but on a smaller, more pathetic scale.
To Marx, Proudhon's mutualism is a Philistine utopia.
It completely fails to understand that the industrial proletariat, the property-less factory workers, are the only class capable of truly revolutionizing society, precisely because they have no small property left to defend.
Okay, but let me jump in here and play devil's advocate for a second. I want to look at this from the perspective of an everyday Parisian in 1849.
Go ahead.
Marx's structural materialist critique is undeniably brilliant on paper. It is theoretically airtight. But isn't it also incredibly detached from the immediate daily suffering of the people on the streets?
How so?
Well, Proudhon was trying to feed families today. He was trying to get a cabinet maker enough credit to buy wood this week so his kids wouldn't starve.
Sure.
Marx is sitting in a library in London, analyzing vast historical epochs, waiting for the objective material conditions to ripen. Is the Marxist critique simply too harsh on a man who was actively trying to put out an immediate blazing fire?
It's a very valid, very human reaction to Marx's critique. It feels cold. But from the Marxist perspective preserved in the archive, Proudhon wasn't just failing to put out the fire. He was actively confusing the workers about the chemical nature of the fire itself.
That's an interesting way to phrase it.
By telling the working class that they could liberate themselves through a peaceful, cooperative credit union, Proudhon was disarming them.
He was teaching them to avoid the state rather than confront it.
Exactly. He was preventing them from realizing that a fundamental, structural, physical confrontation with the capitalist state was mathematically inevitable.
And because of that, Marxists viewed Proudhonism not just as a well-meaning failed experiment, but as a deeply dangerous distraction.
A distraction that would leave the workers entirely defenseless when the state finally decided to use violence against them.
A dangerous distraction. Okay, so if we follow that logic, if Proudhon's peaceful economic bypass was a dead end, both practically because the bank failed and theoretically because it left the state's power untouched. How else could the left seize power?
Right, what's the alternative?
If you cannot outbank the empire, you have to physically overthrow it. And that realization forces our narrative to pivot sharply away from the economic theorists and directly toward the ultimate men of action, the Blanquists.
Yes. If Proudhon believed in peaceful economic reform from below, Blanqui believed in violent political revolution from above.
They called Blanqui l'enfermé, the old one, or the locked up one.
Because he spent almost his entire adult life in prison.
It's staggering to read. Over his lifetime, Blanqui spent something like 33 years in various French dungeons for orchestrating just an endless, non-stop series of armed conspiracies.
He is the absolute embodiment of conspiratorial vanguardism.
Blanquism is a very specific, highly disciplined political strategy. It completely rejects Proudhon's cooperative economics, and it also rejects Marx's reliance on mass, organic working-class movements.
Blanqui believed that the masses were too oppressed, too uneducated, and too heavily propagandized by the church and the state to ever spontaneously organize their own liberation.
Therefore, waiting for the masses to gain class consciousness is, in his eyes, a fool's errand.
Exactly. Instead, Blanquism relies on a tightly organized, highly secretive, hierarchical band of dedicated professional militants.
The vanguard.
Right. Their goal is not to build democratic consensus or pass out pamphlets. Their goal is to secretly stockpile weapons, wait for a moment of extreme political instability, and then seize state power via a sudden, armed, violent uprising, a putsch.
Let's explain how these secretive Blanquist cells actually operated, because it is straight out of a spy novel.
It really is. To avoid police infiltration, they organized in incredibly strict hierarchies.
You had groups of 7 men forming a cell, right?
Yes, and only the commander of that cell knew the commander of the next cell up. They used passwords, secret meeting locations, and the backs of dark cafes.
So if the police caught one cell, they couldn't roll up the whole network because the members literally didn't know who else was in the society.
Exactly. It was compartmentalized. And their theory of governance was just as strict.
What happens after they take over?
Once this small, secretive vanguard successfully seized the government buildings and the telegraph offices, they would immediately establish a temporary, enlightened, revolutionary dictatorship.
A dictatorship to do what?
To aggressively dismantle the old state, strip the church of all its power and wealth, and forcibly educate the masses until they were finally ready for true socialism.
To put this in very modern cinematic terms, if Proudhon was the guy trying to build a decentralized tech startup to disrupt the financial system peacefully, the Blanquists were the action movie heroes.
I like that analogy.
They honestly believed that if they just gathered enough weapons, stormed the right government building, and blew up the right server farm, the entire oppressive system would magically reset in their favor. The masses would just cheer and follow them.
And that exact action movie mentality was put to a brutal, practical test on August 14th, 1870.
Let's set the historical context for that specific date. The Franco-Prussian War is raging. The Prussian military machine is absolutely humiliating the French forces on the battlefield.
The Second Empire of Napoleon III is tottering on the brink of total collapse.
Paris is just a powder keg of anxiety and anger.
And observing this chaos, a group of Blanquists decides that the magical moment has finally arrived.
Blanqui himself is actually secretly in Paris at this time.
Right. And a young, fiery, utterly devoted Blanquist university student named Émile Eudes takes tactical command.
He gathers a small band of armed militants, and they launch a surprise raid on a fire station in the La Villette neighborhood of northeastern Paris.
Now, a fire station. Why in the world would a revolutionary vanguard attack a fire station?
Because it functioned as a local armory for the state. The Blanquists knew there was a significant cache of rifles stored there.
Their tactical blueprint was incredibly simple.
Storm the station, seize the rifles, run out and hand them out to the locals on the street, and spark an immediate, spontaneous insurrection.
They genuinely thought that once they struck the match, the working class of La Villette would organically rise up, grab the guns, and march on the government with them.
But we look at the historical accounts of that afternoon, and that is absolutely not what happens.
Not even close.
Eudes and his men burst into the fire station. They end up shooting a police officer who tries to stop them. They get the weapons, and they run out into the boulevard shouting, "Long live the Republic, death to the Prussians."
They literally try to hand the rifles to the passing workers.
The workers don't join them.
The workers are entirely bewildered. They just stand on the sidewalk staring at these armed students in utter confusion.
Some of the historical accounts Note that the workers actually thought they were Prussian spies trying to cause a riot behind the lines.
Because there had been no groundwork. Without the immediate support of the masses, the Blanquists are completely isolated.
The regular police arrive in force, the crowd scatters, and the Blanquists have to flee for their lives. The push is a total, humiliating fiasco.
And this disaster brings us right back to the theoretical critique in our archives. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are watching this Levallois raid from London, and they are just shaking their heads in frustration.
In their writings, Marx and Engels deliver a scathing assessment. They call the Blanquists the alchemists of the revolution.
The alchemists. That is a brilliant, cutting phrase. Unpack the mechanism behind that insult.
Well, think about what an alchemist does. An alchemist believes they can take base metals and, through sheer willpower and a few secret magical incantations, turn them into gold.
Completely ignoring the actual laws of chemistry and physics.
Exactly. Marx argues that the Blanquists are doing the exact same thing with politics. They are trying to artificially force a revolutionary crisis through sheer willpower and, incendiary bombs.
Completely ignoring the underlying objective structural conditions that are actually required for a successful revolution.
They think they can substitute the heroic action of 50 men for the organized systemic class consciousness of 1,000,000 men.
Exactly. Marx insists that revolutions cannot be conjured out of thin air by a secret society. They require deep, patient, methodical organization.
Despise that slow work.
They absolutely did. And the archive notes a really fascinating structural irony about the Blanquist movement because of this.
Oh, about their funding. This is fascinating.
Right, because they held such profound contempt for the theoretical enlightenment and the slow self-organization of the workers, they didn't have a mass base to fund their movement.
Right. If you are a secret society of 50 guys, you still need money to buy rifles and print manifestos. And if you don't collect dues from a massive union of workers, where do you get the cash?
Ironically, they got it from the habits-mois, the educated bourgeois men in black coats.
Middle class.
Yes. The Blanquist leadership and funding structure relied heavily on radicalized middle-class university students and professionals.
So they were structurally dependent on the very bourgeoisie they were planning to violently overthrow, simply because they refused to build a self-sustaining proletarian movement.
Exactly. It's a massive contradiction.
But again, hold on. I have to challenge this Marxist critique on behalf of the urgency of the moment.
Play devil's advocate again.
Let's go back to August 1870. The Prussian military is literally days away from encircling Paris. The French army is collapsing. Napoleon III is about to be physically captured on the battlefield.
It's an apocalyptic scenario.
Right. Under those extreme conditions, doesn't sitting around waiting for the objective structural conditions to ripen seem like an absurd academic luxury? I mean, weren't the Blanquists, for all their flaws and tactical blunders, the only people in Paris actually doing something to try and save the Republic?
It is the eternal agonizing debate between revolutionary action and structural preparation. The Blanquists would argue, and did argue, that history belongs to those who act decisively in a crisis.
Fortune favors the bold.
Right. But the Marxist counter-argument is that premature action violently divorced from the readiness of the masses doesn't just fail, it actively damages the movement.
How does it damage it?
It provides the state with the perfect, legally justified excuse to crack down. It gets your best, most dedicated militants arrested or executed for nothing.
And it alienates the public.
Exactly. It alienates the very working class you need, who look at a stunt like the Levallois raid and just see a chaotic, frightening riot rather than a war of liberation.
And speaking of getting your best militants arrested,
Yeah.
that brings us to the ultimate fateful flaw in the Blanquist blueprint.
The decapitation strike.
Right. The entire Blanquist strategy hinges on a decisive, uncompromising authoritarian strike, commanded by a singular, unquestioned leader.
Blanqui himself.
But what happens when the state reaches into the shadows and removes that exact leader just one day before history actually requires him?
You get the tactical catastrophe of March 17th, 1871.
Let's set up this timeline because it connects perfectly to our opening hook with the cannons on Montmartre. By early March, Paris is under siege. The government is terrified of the National Guard holding all those cannons.
Adolphe Thiers knows he has to disarm the city.
But Thiers is a very shrewd, calculating politician. He knows that before he sends the troops up the hill to get the guns, he needs to execute a decapitation strike against the radical left.
Thiers understands that Blanqui is the only man in France with the ruthless tactical capability to actually organize a successful armed response to the government.
And Blanqui had been in Paris, but his health was failing, and he had quietly slipped out of the city to rest at a friend's house in the provinces.
Thiers' police track him down.
And on March 17th, literally one day before the raid on the cannons, the police kicked down the door, arrest Blanqui, and secretly speared him away to a heavily fortified prison far away from Paris.
So the old one is back in a cell.
The very next morning, March 18th, Thiers sends Suspier's troops up to Montmartre.
They forget the horses.
The women ring the bells, the troops mutiny, the generals are shot, and the state flees to Versailles. Paris falls into the hands of the revolution.
It is the exact scenario the Blanquists have been dreaming of for decades. The state apparatus has collapsed. The moment for the decisive strike is here.
But there is a massive void at the top. The Blanquist faction inside Paris, led by militant deputies like Raoul Rigaud and Émile Oud, they are just stunned.
Because their entire philosophy, their entire hierarchical structure, is predicated on receiving and executing the orders of Auguste Blanqui.
But Blanqui is gone. The vanguard is utterly rudderless.
We can see this paralyzing confusion in the primary sources from the night of March 18th. The Central Committee of the National Guard is meeting in the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. It's absolute chaos.
Rigaud and Oud, acting on their pure Blanquist instincts, are shouting that they must go on the offensive immediately.
They demand that the National Guard march directly on Versailles that very night to crush Thiers while his army is still in a state of demoralized mutiny.
But because they do not have the towering, unquestionable authority of Blanqui in the room to force the issue, they are outvoted.
The Central Committee, which is a mixed bag of various moderate and radical factions, hesitates.
They are terrified of starting a full-blown civil war. They argue that they only have a defensive mandate.
So instead of marching on Versailles, they decide to stay in Paris, maintain order, and hold legal municipal elections.
Okay, this is the ultimate historical what-if of the Paris Commune. And I need you to unpack this for us, because the sources just obsess over it.
It's the great debate.
If Blanqui had not been arrested on the 17th, if he had been standing at the head of the table in the Hôtel de Ville on the night of March 18th, would his decisive authoritarian command have forced that march on Versailles?
And if they had marched, would they have crushed Thiers and saved the Commune? Or would it have just accelerated a bloodbath in the suburbs?
What did the archives say?
Well, this question is the great haunting parlor game for historians of the left. When Leon Trotsky analyzes the Commune decades later, he is absolutely unequivocal.
What's Trotsky's take?
Trotsky argued that the failure to march on Versailles immediately was the single most fatal mistake of the Commune. He firmly believed that if Blanqui had been there, his sheer uncompromising force of will would have compelled the National Guard to march.
And he thinks they would have won.
Yes. Because Thiers' army was currently refusing to fight, Trotsky believed a rapid strike would have shattered the bourgeois government entirely, a decapitation strike in reverse.
But what do the granular social historians say? Because there's a very different read on the capacity of the Parisian workers that night.
Yes, looking at the structural reality of the National Guard, many historians argue that Trotsky is just projecting later Bolshevik discipline onto a 19th century militia.
The National Guard wasn't a professional army.
Exactly. They were inherently defensive. They were deeply tied to their specific neighborhoods, their families, their local barricades. They were not an offensive expeditionary force.
So even with Blanqui shouting orders, it is highly debatable whether these fiercely independent, localized battalions could have been organized to execute a complex night march and a siege against a fortified palace at Versailles.
If they had tried and failed, the Commune might have been slaughtered in March instead of May.
But they didn't march. They stayed in Paris. They hold those municipal elections on March 26. They officially established the Council of the Paris Commune.
And this is where the ideological architecture we've been mapping out finally solidifies into a physical government.
All these fractured blueprints, Proudhon's decentralized cooperative mutualism, Blanqui's authoritarian political vanguardism, and the emerging Marxist internationalism, all of them violently collide in a single legislative room at the Hôtel de Ville.
And that elected council was globally unprecedented. It was the first legislative assembly in history where over a quarter of the representatives were actual manual workers.
But the class unity ended the moment the doors closed. The council immediately and bitterly fractured into two opposing camps, the majority and the minority.
Let's clearly define the mechanics of these two camps, starting with the majority.
The majority was comprised primarily of the Blanquists, who we've discussed, and the Neo-Jacobins.
Right. And the Neo-Jacobins, represented by older, venerated figures like Charles de Lescluze, they looked backward for their inspiration.
They idolized the original French Revolution of 1793.
Their political blueprint was entirely focused on centralized political power. They demanded a powerful committee of public safety, exactly like Robespierre had, to ruthlessly hunt down internal traitors, censor the press, and direct the war effort from the top down.
So, pure, uncompromising political control. Revolution by decree.
Yes. On the other side of the room, you had the minority. This group was largely made up of members of the International Workingmen's Association.
This is a crucial transition, because the First International in Paris had just undergone a massive ideological shift.
We have to talk about the Place de la Corée du Temple.
Right, that's where the International had its headquarters in Paris. Just a few years earlier, the Paris branch was dominated by right-wing Proudhonists like Henri Tolaine.
Tolaine was a strict mutualist who actually opposed labor strikes.
Which sounds crazy for a labor organizer.
He thought going on strike was a violation of free trade. But by 1871, the International in Paris had been completely taken over by the revolutionary proletarian wing.
Exactly. And this radicalized wing was led by brilliant organizers like Eugene Varlin, the Hungarian socialist Leo Frankel, and the young Russian revolutionary Elizabeth Dmitriev.
This minority faction vehemently opposed the Blanquist idea of a revolutionary dictatorship. They voted against the Committee of Public Safety.
Their primary focus was not on political terror or historical cosplay of 1793. Their focus was on enacting immediate social and economic measures to actually emancipate the working class.
We see this in the specific decrees they fought for.
What kind of decrees?
Well, the minority pushed through decrees banning the grueling night work for bakers. They established a moratorium on rent payments, which saved thousands of families from eviction.
They also ordered the municipal pawn shops to return the tools and clothing that desperate workers had pawned during the siege.
And most radically, they passed a decree stating that any factory abandoned by a fleeing capitalist could be immediately seized and run cooperatively by the workers themselves.
That is the crucial pivot from Proudhon to early Marxism. They are no longer just trying to bypass the system with a credit union. They are actively seizing the physical means of production.
But this creates an incredible, bizarre paradox within the Commune, particularly regarding the Blanquists.
The archive highlights this massive contradiction. The Blanquists had a highly developed theory for how to seize power, the armed putsch, and how to hold it, the dictatorship.
But they had almost no coherent economic theory for what to do afterward.
It's a profound cognitive dissonance.
Because the Blanquists lacked their own economic blueprint, many of them just defaulted to Proudhonist theories of a decentralized cooperative economy.
Yet, in their political practice, they were violently acting as centralizing authoritarians.
They wanted a decentralized economy enforced by a centralized police state.
To see exactly what that police state looked like in granular detail, we have to look at the darkest, most fascinating character in the Commune, Raoul Rigaud.
Rigaud was a cynical, fiercely dedicated 24-year-old Blanquist.
And the Commune hands this kid the keys to the prefecture of police. Imagine taking a young radical who has spent his entire adult life being hunted by the secret police and suddenly putting him in charge of the entire state's surveillance and arrest apparatus.
Rigaud applies the Blanquist blueprint with terrifying efficiency. He immediately sets about building his own miniature police state within the Commune.
He utilizes the exact same network of informants and spies that the empire used, just turning them against the bourgeoisie.
He unilaterally shuts down opposition newspapers. He signs blank arrest warrants. And most fatefully, he implements the law of hostages.
The hostage policy. Explain the mechanics of this, because it becomes the moral breaking point of the Commune.
As the Versailles army begins executing captured National Guardsmen outside the city, Rigaud demands leverage. He begins arresting prominent figures in Paris: priests, the Archbishop of Paris, former gendarmes, wealthy bourgeois citizens, and locks them in prison.
The decree states that for every communard executed by Versailles, 3 hostages will be shot in return.
The grim, bloody reality of the Blanquist tactic. It wasn't just abstract political theory discussed in cafes. It meant men in heavy black coats kicking down doors at midnight and dragging priests out of their beds.
Rigaud even personally oversaw the execution of political enemies, like his former friend Gustave Chaudet.
Chaudet was a Republican who had ordered troops to fire on protesters months earlier. Rigaud has him marched into a courtyard and shot.
And this authoritarian spiral reaches its horrific climax during the final days of the Commune, known as the Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week in late May.
The Versailles army breaches the walls of Paris. They're sweeping through the boulevards, summarily executing tens of thousands of communards.
The city's burning. The Commune has collapsed into desperate, localized street fighting.
And in that apocalyptic chaos, the Blanquist hostage policy reaches its inevitable conclusion at a place called Rue Haxo.
I want to narrate this moment carefully because it perfectly encapsulates the violent fracture of the left in real time. It is May 26. The Versailles army is closing in.
A frantic, terrified crowd, led by Blanquist militants, marches a group of about 50 hostages, mostly priests and captured policemen, to a garden enclosure on Rue Haxo.
The crowd is out for blood. They want vengeance for the thousands of Parisians being slaughtered just down the street.
And into this chaotic, bloodthirsty mob steps Eugene Varlin.
Varlin is a prominent leader of the internationalist minority. He is a bookbinder by trade. He has dedicated his entire life to organizing workers peacefully, fighting for social emancipation.
He represents the exact opposite of Rigaud's police state.
When Varlin hears about the hostages, he rushes to Rue Haxo. He physically throws himself in front of the armed crowd. He screams at them to stop.
He argues desperately that executing unarmed prisoners violates every principle of justice the social revolution stands for.
He tells them they are sinking to the level of the butchers of Versailles.
But the theoretical debate is over. The logic of violence has taken over. Varlin is physically overpowered.
He is pushed aside, beaten, and nearly lynched by his own side. The Blanquist commanders order the crowd to fire, and the 50 hostages are gunned down against the wall in a chaotic massacre.
The ideological divide between the social emancipator and the authoritarian avenger was sealed in blood.
And tragically, Varlin himself would be captured by the Versailles army just 2 days later. He was paraded through the streets, brutally tortured, and executed.
What is utterly fascinating for historians is how this exact tension, the necessity of centralized power versus the desire for social liberation, did not die at the barricades.
No, it became the defining obsession for the generation of revolutionaries that followed.
When we pull in the later analyses from our archive, specifically the writings of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, we see them looking directly back at the blood-stained council room in Paris, trying to solve the paradox.
They studied the Commune obsessively. It was their foundational textbook. Look at Lenin's State and Revolution, written right before the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917. What is Lenin's main takeaway from the Commune?
Lenin focuses on a realization Karl Marx had while watching the Commune unfold. Marx wrote that the working class, quote, cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes.
Lenin really seized on this mechanic.
He argued that Proudhon was wrong to think you could bypass the state, but Blanqui was also wrong to think you could just take over the existing police and bureaucracy and use it.
Lenin argued that the Commune proved the old bourgeois state had to be fundamentally smashed, shattered to pieces, and replaced with an entirely new type of armed proletarian apparatus.
And Trotsky takes that analysis of state power even further into the realm of violence, doesn't he?
In his 1920 book, Terrorism and Communism, Trotsky is looking directly at Raoul Rigaud and the Blanquist terror.
Yes. Context is crucial here. Trotsky is writing during the darkest days of the Russian Civil War. He's actively commanding the Red Army, and he is defending the Bolshevik use of the Red Terror against democratic, moderate socialist critics like Karl Kautsky.
Trotsky looks back at the Paris Commune, and he makes a chillingly pragmatic argument.
He argues that the Blanquists weren't wrong to use terror and take hostages. Their fatal mistake was that they weren't ruthless and organized enough.
He actually defends Rigaud.
He defends the mechanism of terror in a civil war context. Trotsky highlights what he saw as the brutal mathematical logic of historical expediency.
He argues that if the enemy class is actively slaughtering your people, as Versailles systematically slaughtered tens of thousands of communards during the Bloody Week, then hesitation, moralizing, and democratic delays are the greatest crimes a revolutionary can commit.
To Trotsky, the failure to march on Versailles and the failure to ruthlessly crush internal dissent in March guaranteed the massacre in May.
Okay, let's step back from the fires of the Semaine Sanglante and bring you back out of the archives. Let's synthesize this incredible, heavy, deep dive.
We started our journey by mapping Haussmann's physical boulevards, a physical architecture explicitly designed to displace and control the working class.
Today, we've seen how the ideological blueprints of the left attempted to dismantle that control, and how they violently clash with each other in the streets.
We saw Proudhon's mutualism, the dream of localized cooperative credit collapse because it failed to confront the centralized power of the state and capital.
We saw Blanqui's conspiratorial vanguardism, the action movie Putsch fail, because it divorced itself from the actual organized will of the masses.
And we saw Marx's structural theories of class struggle beginning to take root among the internationalists who fought for true social emancipation but found themselves outvoted and overpowered by authoritarian terror.
The physical barricades built across Paris were absolutely matched by the theoretical barricades erected inside the Commune's own council room.
The tragedy of the Commune is that these men and women only had 72 days.
They had 72 days to try and reconcile these massive, fundamentally opposed theoretical differences, all while simultaneously fighting a desperate war for their very survival against a merciless regular army.
It is a crucible of political theory. Every contradiction of modern governance was forced to the surface in a matter of weeks.
Which brings us to our final, lingering question for you to mull over as we close the archives for today. It's a question that survived the fires of Paris, deeply infected the Russian Revolution, and haunted the entire 20th century.
When a new society is being violently born out of the ashes of the old, does it fundamentally require an authoritarian vanguard, a secret police, a Rigaud, a Blanqui, to protect it from being immediately crushed by reactionary forces?
Or does the very act of centralizing that power, of building that police state, inherently destroy the exact social emancipation, the very freedom the revolution was trying to achieve in the first place?
It is the paradox of power. And as the blood on Rue Haxo demonstrates, it is a paradox that no theoretical blueprint has quite managed to solve.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fractured left. Keep questioning the blueprints of history, and we'll see you for part 3 of this deep dive.